Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version and our other shows. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I feel like I say that a lot, but there is a special place in my heart for the Halloween stories. I love them so much. It might not seem like an obvious overlap, but it's real. Cozy and spooky can actually go together. And for the most part, I'd say my Halloween stories aren't really spooky at all. I'd say what my Halloween stories are mysterious, but slightly magical. I'm someone who is always looking for scraps of magic shining through the everyday. So October feels like the perfect month to lean into that. If you are new to our show and you're like, ma'am, what are you talking about? Welcome. I'm a writer and a world builder, and I specifically create spaces where listeners and readers can feel safe and calm and connected to good things. The stories you hear on this show come from my bedtime story podcast called Nothing Much Happens, and they all take place in a shared universe. I call it the Village of Nothing Much. Lots of listeners wanted to actually hear the stories rather than just hear 10 seconds of my melodic sleep voice and immediately zonk out. So we created this show. Listen whenever you want to step into a cozy world and enjoy some ordinary magic. And if you stick around after the show, I will give you some behind-the-scenes info about these stories. Now, just because it feels good, let's take a deep breath in through the nose and sigh from the mouth. Again, breathe in and let it go. Good. Our stories today treat you and only maybe a little trick you at one of the best times of year. We'll start with Halloween in an old house, listening for a bump in the attic as we toast our pumpkin seeds and get ready for visitors at the door. Then we'll roll up the sleeves on our favorite flannel shirt and head out into the mowed-down hayfields to visit a friend in Scarecrow. Finally, we'll get into costume and stop in front of that old house on the corner that never seems to have any lights on, in Trick or Treat. Halloween in an old house. Years ago, while traveling through Europe in my late teens, I'd stepped down onto a train platform and been stopped in my tracks by the thought that, in that moment, I could be anybody. None of the people spilling past from the trains around me knew anything about me. I could reinvent myself if I liked, claim a different name, speak with an accent, be brave about things I hadn't been brave about before, or just try on a different kind of life. Isn't that part of the appeal of Halloween? A chance to try on something different? A mask, a costume, and the leeway of the day, allowing each other a bit of strangeness. I thought about it while I looked through my closet a few hours before the trick-or-treating was likely to begin. I never buy costumes. I'd rather put some old clothes together creatively than get something from a plastic bag. I pushed through the hangers and found a black overcoat that could be made to look a bit like a witch's robe. I clucked my tongue. Not a witch again. Past that, I found an old dress. Long and scarlet, cut a bit close with a high waist. All right. I had a Pride and Prejudice phase. We were all young once. On a hook beside it was a crown, silly, golden, and bedazzled, something I'd been given to wear at a bachelorette night out and had somehow made it home with. I looked at the crown and the dark red dress and slipped a necklace off a hook, a costume piece with a big red heart hanging from it. Queen of Hearts? I said aloud. Bump, said the attic. Oh, thank you for your input. I smiled up at the ceiling above. The attic didn't usually have much to say. Once, maybe twice a day, there was a soft, inconspicuous bump, as if someone had just set their coffee mug down a bit hard on a table or closed a book for the night. In fact, usually it was an evening ritual. 10 minutes or so before bedtime, I'd hear that muffled thump, and I'd set down my book and call out, "Me too, then. Lights out, shall we? Sleep tight." It was an old house, and it was likely to have the strange sounds and flickering wiring that old houses do. But honestly, that bump had always felt like a friendly wave from a neighbor that you know by sight but not by name. We nodded at each other, then moved on with our days, and besides, everyone has to live somewhere. So Queen of Hearts it was then. That was decided on. I took the dress out to the landing where a wide window looked down to the street. I opened it and let the cool, spicy Halloween night air in. I hung the dress from the window sash to let it air out and leaned out a moment, elbows on the sill, to watch the street. Neighbors were setting out pumpkins on stoops, and children were stepping off the bus, kicking through and falling into piles of leaves, dressed already in their costumes. I remembered that giddy thrill of being allowed to wear my costume to school, and a whole school day lost to parties and parades and candy. The excitement of children is completely untempered, undiluted, and even at this distance, it was contagious. I drummed my fingers on the sill, then spun on my heel and headed down into the kitchen. The pumpkin carving was done. I'd done that earlier. An old monster movie playing in the background while I scooped out the seeds and cut silly faces in. Now the seeds were roasting in the oven, and by the smell, they were just about done. I'd coated them with olive oil and sea salt and black pepper, and they were crispy, and when I popped a few into my mouth, they sizzled on my tongue deliciously. I spooned them into a bowl for snacking on while I handed out treats. I bustled around the house, lighting candles and getting my giant treat bowl ready. I took out my pumpkins and set them up on my front step. I amused myself for a while, setting them up in different scenarios. See, this pumpkin is in love with that one, and this one's jealous. I was having a bit too much fun for a grown-up alone on her porch on Halloween, but I looked around and didn't see anyone watching, so carried on for a bit. The light was changing. At this time of year, sunset happened in just a few minutes, and dusk would go to darkness soon. I lit the candles and the jack-o'-lanterns and rushed back upstairs to get into my dress and crown. The landing was properly chilly now, and I closed the window and pulled my dress down from its spot. As I turned to head back to my room, I stopped short. The attic stairs had dropped down from the ceiling and were resting on the landing floor. They were that old sort of retractable steps you pulled a cord from the ceiling to release, but I hadn't pulled the cord. I took a very deep breath. "Very well," I said calmly. "I suppose if there were one night of the year when you're allowed to act up a bit, it would be Halloween night." I took the following silence for agreement and edged around the steps into my room, closing the door behind me as I got into my dress. There was a lingering chill in my body, that was certain, but I remembered the excitement of the kids gearing up for their neighborhood prowl and how it had gotten into my system a bit ago, and thought it must be even more contagious than I thought. I settled my crown onto my head and looped the silly heart necklace around my throat, slipped my feet into some old red velvet slippers, and heard the first call of trick or treat from the front door. "We'd better get down there," I called out. Bump. Scarecrow. Dry leaves crunched under my feet as I crossed the field. I'd set him up in the spring, when the plants were just taking root, when the garden had neat rows and weeded edges, before the wild growth of the summer, which turned the plot into a bright green patch exploding with tendrils and stalks, giant leaves and fruit. Now it had all been plowed back into the soil, and raked leaves mixed with compost spread on top. In the summer, the air had been thick, and breezes few. They seemed to struggle to push through the vines and stems. Now that the land was clear, an autumn wind was rolling easily over it, turning over the dry leaves as they tumbled in front of me. He was propped up where the vegetable patch met the strawberry plants, where he'd stood all summer with his back to the corn and his painted face toward the berries. I'd put him out in hopes of keeping at least half of the strawberries for ourselves. But within a week or two of his appearance, the birds were so comfortable with him that they sat on his flannel arms, and even built a nest in the brim of his hat. Ah well, I reminded myself when I'd come hopefully for the strawberries, to find only 2 or 3 whole and red on the vine. The land wasn't just for me and mine, and everyone has to eat. We joked, in fact, that he wasn't so much a scarecrow as a welcome crow, and we guessed we'd rather live somewhere that was welcoming. When I got to him, I found him a bit slumped over. The recent rains had drenched his stuffing and left him looking down at the tines of the pitchfork that were his backbone. I stepped around to his front and helped him upright again, saying under my breath a line from a poem that my grandmother used to say to me. "Don't grow a wishbone where your backbone ought to be." He slumped again, and I decided he would need fresh hay to hold himself up with a bit of dignity, so pulled him down completely from the fork handle and laid him on the ground. He was made of an old button-down shirt, worn through at the elbows and with a hole in the breast pocket. He had a pair of overalls that helped keep him together, no boots, but garden gloves that were safety pinned to the ends of his sleeves, just like my own mittens had been to my winter coat when I was a child. We'd neither of us lost them, so well done us. His head was a pillowcase stuffed with more hay, a face drawn on with markers that had bled in the rain a bit, and his smeared face sent a small shiver up my spine. Maybe he was a scarecrow after all. I took the old woven sun hat from his head and shook the deserted bird's nest from the brim. I took all the old straw out of him and spread it out with the leaves and compost in the garden. In the next field over, the winter hay had been cut, and the land was dotted with tall rolls of it, waiting to dry and be hauled away to feed goats and horses till the spring. The bales smelled so good, like the best part of a barn on a warm day. Sweet but pungent, and I was tempted to climb one and spend a few minutes stretched out on my back on top, with my hands cupped behind my head and my eyes closed, just listening to the quiet sounds of the mostly bare field. But I remembered my friend in pieces by the strawberry patch, and started to gather handfuls of fresh-cut hay where they'd been missed by the baler. Soon I had an armful and carried it back across the fields. I packed it into his legs and arms and body till he was standing again, with the pitchfork slipped through the back of his shirt. I arranged his arms, extended in welcome with the help of a bit of wire I'd brought from the shed. I refilled his pillowcase and turned his smeared face around to the back. Drew a new one with markers from my pocket. Brown eyes and a clumsy curved nose, and a bright red smile that made another shiver go through me. Maybe there just isn't a way to draw a face on a scarecrow or carve one into a pumpkin that feels friendly and not at least a little creepy. I patted down my pockets, hoping to find something to soften the effect, and found a pair of scratched, backup sunglasses. Perfect. I pushed them onto his face, bunching the straw to give him cheeks for the lenses to rest on, and plopped his hat on top. I stood back a few paces and set my hands on my hips and took him in. He looked good as new, which for a scarecrow is still a bit shabby. But I was leaving him better than I found him, and that was a personal goal for me whenever I crossed paths with another. I gathered up the spare bit of wire and recapped my markers, tucked them all back into my pockets. I turned toward the hayfield, thinking maybe I would climb that bale now, but the sky over the field had turned a dark, stormy gray. I could smell rain and felt the wind kicking up around my legs. As long as there were no flashes of lightning, I liked to stay until the rain started, to feel the pressure change and the temperature drop, and watch the light dim from behind the thick clouds. It would be a good long storm, keeping us in for the rest of the day, and I hoped my scarecrow's new stuffing would hold up against it. In the distance, I saw a flash and decided I'd stayed out long enough. I turned toward the house and picked up my pace as I crossed back over the field. The thunder came booming from the strike point and made me jump and laugh at myself. That autumn chill, that slight eerie feeling that comes with the month of October, it had gotten into me while I was remaking the Scarecrow. And now, knowing I was being silly, I began to run and thought better of looking over my shoulder, remembering how I'd turned his head around, how his smeared summer face would be watching me as I ran. Silly or not, I locked the door behind me when I got to the house. Trick or treat. The sunlight was almost gone. In another 10 minutes, it would be dark. I stepped out onto the porch and looked up and down the street. There were jack-o'-lanterns lit on front steps and balancing on porch railings at nearly every house. I heard my neighbor's front door open a moment later. She flicked on her porch light and stepped into the halo it cast, dressed in a high-waisted, scarlet-colored dress, a tiara on her head, and a heart-shaped jewel on a chain around her neck. She struck a match and lifted the stem cap of the giant pumpkin on her top step and lit the candle inside. I waited for her to shake out the match, for the fire to turn to smoke rippling away from her fingers, then called out to her. "Are you the Queen of Hearts again? That makes 3 years in a row, doesn't it? She laughed as she looked over at me and adjusted her crown. She called something back, but a gust of wind rolled down the street, and I barely heard her over the sound of falling leaves caught in its pull. I thought she'd said something about it being the house's favorite, but when I looked back at her porch, she'd already gone back inside. I scanned up and down the street again, and far at the end of the next block, I saw a few trick-or-treaters setting off. It was time. I set a large bowl of candy on a table by my front door, stretching a bit of fake cobweb over the top to give the littles a thrill. Usually I'd stay and hand out candy till all the porch lights had gone out. But this year I had a different job. My nephews had asked for me especially. Had said this year, couldn't Auntie take them? I'd buffed my nails on my shirt, pleased that I must have finally achieved what I'd set out for since they were babies. to be a cool aunt. And in the vein of being a cool aunt, had agreed to let them pick out my costume. The youngest had lost one of his front teeth the day before, and it seemed to offer some inspiration. He pointed to me and said, "Tooth Fairy," and that was that. Well, I'd rather have been a pirate, but had already shaken on the deal, so I'd pulled together a pink tutu that I wore over my jeans and sneakers, made a wand from a dowel with a cardboard cutout of a tooth stuck on top, and found some sparkly fairy wings at the resale shop, which were helpfully already sewn onto the back of a jacket. It was a varsity jacket, in fact, and I'd taped a "Hello, my name is" sticker over the previous owner's name and written in bright orange Sharpie, "Maxine T. Fairy." I laughed as I did it. It was a bit of family lore, a story our mother had always told us, that the Tooth Fairy's name was Maxine. It was one of those things that you took for true, for a universally known fact, and only realized later wasn't any such thing. For example, when saying it out loud in front of a group of adults at a party. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Now the night was upon us. The candy bowl was full, and I was kitted up and ready to be on my way. Luckily, my nephews lived just around the corner. I hopped down the front steps and out onto the sidewalk. Already the number of trick-or-treaters had tripled, and up and down the street doors were opening and letting all sorts of characters out into the chilly night air. I passed superheroes and zombies, clever witches and silver-whiskered cats. Little clumps of excited, roving kids with orange pails or pillowcases in their hands. Their grown-ups attempting to let them take the lead, but not get too far ahead. I guessed that was a constant process in parenting. At the corner, the wind picked up again in a sudden gust, and the trick-or-treaters gave shrieks of happy fright and hustled up walkways to call out at the lit front doors. That gust of wind had spun me around, and I looked up at the house on the corner. There wasn't a light on in the whole house. And as I thought about it, I realized I couldn't remember ever having seen anyone there. It was strange. In this neighborhood, I knew most everyone. We had block parties and did spring cleanup together every year, sweeping out the gutters and planting impatiens around the trees in the avenue. But it was almost as though I'd barely ever noticed this house. It had a long cobblestone drive and a pretty sweeping roofline over a front porch where a swing was hung. It was still swinging from the gust of wind that had blown me around, although the rest of the house was still and quiet. Right in the corner of the yard at the edge of the sidewalk was a tiny lending library. And even in the dim light, I could see it was stocked with books. I peered in a little closer and saw a small, round pumpkin, no bigger than an apple, carved with a crooked grin sitting on the shelf. The wind came again in a cool blast and seemed to push me on around the corner toward my nephews, and the house was forgotten again. As I picked up my pace, knowing they must be eager and excited to get out on the street, I was no less excited. I knew as they got older, they'd rightly spend more time with friends, eventually head out on Halloween nights without me, without their dads. So tonight was special, and I meant to enjoy each minute of it. Soon I was bounding up their front steps, admiring their 4 pumpkins carved with varying degrees of creative skill, but all of them fun to look at, and hid out behind a couple taller kids holding out their bags to my brother on the doorstep. When they turned back toward the sidewalk, already bargaining, trading treats to get their favorites, I popped up and held out my hand, saying, "Trick or treat." My brother laughed at my costume and handed me a bag of sweet and salty popcorn. "Treat," he said, and gave me his best big brother stare. The boys saw me through the open door and rushed out with their bags. "Tooth Fairy," called the youngest in approval. He was dressed in a furry blonde suit with floppy ears and a tail. "I'm the dog," he said, pointing to their giant retriever who sat thumping her tail on the carpet and being a very good girl. The oldest was a wizard, though he didn't have a pointed hat or spangled cloak. When I asked him about it, he explained to me that that was a very old-fashioned idea of wizards and that I had a lot to learn. He read my name tag and gave me a questioning look. "How do you know the Tooth Fairy's name is Maxine?" I squatted down beside him and whispered, "Everyone knows that. Ask your dad." "Dad, what's the Tooth Fairy's name?" My brother, hero that he is, still handing out popcorn to the next batch of pirates and ghosts, said immediately, "Maxine." They both looked up at me in wonder. Cool aunt. And out into the night we went. Okay, are y'all still with me after that Scarecrow story? I hope you made it. Our first story tonight, Halloween in an Old House, is from way back in season 2, and it is very autobiographical. First, I did live in Europe as a teenager, and frequently thought about how I could be anybody when I stepped down from a train. And second, and maybe I'm burying the lead here, I live in a haunted house. My house turns 100 next year, and it was built by a man named Paul McFarlane in 1925. He was an artist in many ways. He wrote and translated books, he designed and painted theater sets, but his main area of focus was puppeteering. Yes, I live in a house haunted by puppets, and ... I love it. It's a very friendly haunting. Paul died in the house in the 50s from cancer, and his collection of puppets are still lovingly held at the Detroit Institute of Arts, where we have been to visit them. I also have a few of the books he translated and wrote on our shelves. The bump in the attic and the falling stairs are very real. The bump comes a few times a day, but most reliably at around 9:45. It happens right over our bed, and we interpret it to mean good night. And sometimes, you should put your phones down. It has come over the years at moments when I felt alone or anxious, and it always felt like a bit of company and comfort. I would honestly really miss it if it went away. The attic stairs drop on their own a couple times a year, and when they do, when I step into the hall and find them descended into place, I'll call out, "Okay, have your fun, I'll give you a few days." And I do. I let them get it out of their system, and then after a week or so, I push them back up into place. One thing I do not do is go up into the attic. I just don't feel like it's any of my business. Various people have gone up in the years we've lived here, electricians and roof repair guys. And one person told me there is a desk up there with a typewriter on it. And my wife pointed out that this house is where I finally started writing, after wanting to for decades. So I feel like the house has a good influence on me. It inspires me. I know that there are also a few boxes and a trunk up there, but I am happy to leave those to the next inhabitants of the house. A couple of years ago, an electrician said he found some large pictures up there, and could he bring them down? I hesitated, honestly, as I feel like what's up there should stay up there. But in the end, I relented. One, by the clothes of the picture's subjects, I'd guess was taken in the first decade of the 20th century. A family in front of a big house, which I think might be Paul's family home, not this house. And the other two were very serious portraits of a man and a woman in dour black clothes. Very definitely not smiling. I then felt the responsibility of holding on to these pictures, but also didn't really want to display them anywhere. And they now sit wrapped in tissue on a shelf in a closet in my office. But here's the strange thing. For 6 months after those came down, no knock. Ever. After 6 years of daily knocks, the attic went silent. I thought, oh, Maybe they just wanted out. Then slowly the knocks came back, just one every now and then eventually back to their regular schedule. I probably should stop guessing what they are saying, but I do appreciate the company. And like I said in my story, everybody's got to live somewhere, including the inhabitants of my attic. So the second story originally appeared as a bonus story for our premium members. Otherwise, I think I would have worried that it was just not right for our main feed. I think the image of that smeared face watching you run across the farm fields, it's a good one. Hollywood, call me. I have ideas. I'd say the narrator of this story has appeared in a few others. One called The Pumpkin Farmer, and one that just came out on Nothing Much Happens called New Owners at the Orchard. Eventually, these stories will make their way over here to the village. Finally, the last story today, Trick or Treat, was just chock full of Easter eggs. The neighbor on the front porch at the start of the story is definitely the narrator of Halloween in an Old House. The house with the little library that sits in darkness on the corner is also part of the story, The Other Innkeeper, and is key to sending her on her way to her new calling. The Cool Aunt has a slew of stories, including Back to School and The Lady in the Painting, both of which appear on this show, episode 20, if you'd like to go back. She and the nephews and their dads were just at the wedding a couple episodes back, and there are many more. The bit about the Tooth Fairy being named Maxine comes from a story published by Jim Henson in the 80s. It was in a magazine, though I don't know which one, and it was told from Kermit's perspective about him hanging out with other special types of celebrities, just like him, including Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, who he said was a nice lady named Maxine. So it's a bit of real family lore for the Nicolais. Now, every year, Bob has taken our Halloween stories and spooked them up properly. And those all live on our website, nothingmuchhappens.com. So if you need a bit more haunted Village of Nothing Much, head over there, look for the tab under stories that is labeled Scary Stuff. And we've also got it linked in our notes. And if you'd like to see the photos that came down from the attic, head over to our Instagram. It's in our show notes too. And leave us a comment or message, and maybe I'll share them. We'll be back next week with more Halloween-y stories. Till then, I wish you moments of wonder and mystery, fresh crisp air, and the friendship of a ghost in the attic.